Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Great. All right, so I think we are started up here. I'm going to turn my video off and hand it over to our moderator, Bryant, to get us started off.
Thank you, Lauren. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the current events affecting transportation session on day 2. We have 3 great presentations today. The first presentation is going to be COVID-19 impacts in NC, traffic data collection and future network implication. We have 5 great speakers lined up for this presentation. Give you a quick intro. Keith Bryant. Keith has 20 years of experience, and he has been with the City of Charlotte for 6 years. He is a senior product manager for the design section there. He has a master's degree from West Virginia University and has passion for camping and outdoors. The second speaker is Andy Mix. Andy is a graduate of Toledo. He has a bioengineering degree and a master's in management from Duke's Business School. And he's a senior operations manager at Quality Counts. Our third speaker is Bastian Schroeder. Bastian has previous experience working at Itchery and is currently working as a principal engineer at Kittelson's Wilmington office. He specializes in multimodal safety and operations of traffic systems for local, state, and federal clients. And our fourth speaker is Kerry Morrow. Kerry has been leading NCDOT's traffic safety group since 2018. She oversees North Carolina's statewide traffic monitoring program and the team that keeps it running smoothly. Kerry is a mother of 2 rambunctious girls and a graduate of NC State University. Our fifth speaker for this presentation is Martin Kinnamon. Martin has been a travel demand modeler for Charlotte DOT for 13 years. He's a proud graduate of NC State University and UNC Charlotte. Since COVID, the time that he used to spend in his car is now mostly taken up watching birds in his backyard, and he is eagerly awaiting the return of a white-throated sparrow. So, at the end of this presentation, we can take some questions, so please type your questions into the chat window. Again, please type them into the chat window. Keith, please take it away.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Great. So my name is Keith Bryant. I'm a senior project manager for the Charlotte DOT, and I also serve as the city's count program manager. So as you know, over the past year, a lot has changed within our lives and a lot has changed within our industry. Now we stockpile hand sanitizer and attend 50 Zoom meetings a week. In our session, we will be focusing on the changes that COVID has caused to our transportation network. And you and I all know that we all have friends and family members that think they're traffic engineers and that they know what's going on out there in our roads. But let's actually take a look at some data and try to quantify what has happened and how this may inform what happens in the future. So let me give you a rundown of how the presentation will go. First, we're going to sort of set the table and talk about the upfront things a little bit, and then we're going to switch over and talk about some data collection efforts. We'll talk about a little bit about the national scene, and then window into statewide data collection, and finish up with some local municipal data collection here in Charlotte. Then we're going to pivot and we're going to talk about what this data might mean in the future. We're going to look at regional modeling impacts and then just sort of wrap it up and talk about the overall big picture. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Bastian Schroeder, and he's going to kick us off.
Yes, thank you, Keith, and good morning. So to start things out, we wanted to start with some national travel trends. And so here's some numbers that I borrowed from Neil Peterson, who's the TRB Executive Director. So this is a presentation he gave at the ITE annual meeting to really just kind of set the tone. And I think many of you are familiar with these numbers, but really drastic reductions in air travel, 96% reduction in TSA checkpoints that in April that recovered to about 73% in July. Passenger car travel down 44%, that then recovered to only about an 11% reduction when we look at the average daily traffic. public transportation and ride hailing continuing to be down. So really the big pattern there is everybody initially stayed home and didn't know how to react to the pandemic. And the personal car travel, individual vehicles without having to mingle with people we don't know, that recovered. But at any time we're talking about shared movements, those numbers stayed quite low and are continuing to be low in many parts of the country. Next slide. If we look at the data trends, this is data compiled by the University of Washington Star Lab, looking really at the trends. This is a really great way to think about what happened with COVID. We went from a baseline pre-March to a very rapid reduction of travel, and then really a steady recovery over time, then stabilizing at around a 10% reduction AADT, or this particular chart is expressed as VMT, vehicle miles traveled. So that's consistent with the data that INRIX provided in the previous slide, and I think it's consistent with what we're seeing in North Carolina. This is for personal travel. The reasons for this, so there's a survey done here by the University of California, Davis, really looking at, on the left, pre-COVID, 70% of workers really commuting to work 5 days or more a week, which now has transitioned to more than half of us really staying home all the time, or the majority of the time. And so I think this is not a surprise to many, but this is really what is driving the travel patterns that we're seeing. So with this national context, I'll hand it over to Andy and then others to really look at what we're seeing in North Carolina.
Thanks, Bastian. So at the beginning of the pandemic, Quality Counts was really trying to brainstorm some ideas of how to stay relevant while we were mostly no longer able to collect traffic data, at least get paid to collect that traffic data. We've been working on a historical database for quite a while and decided it made sense to make this our focus for the short term. We were able to create this web database that shows where all of our historical data is located and made that available to our clients. Our second priority during the initial shutdowns was to just start collecting data. Although we didn't have any contracts in place, we assumed that some agencies would be interested in data during this time, and we took it upon ourselves to start this process. With the help of Kittelson and our historical database, we were able to select 150 locations nationwide, including 27 in the Charlotte metro area, which were all on non-freeway roads. So you can see the picture there on the right. That's where we collected a lot of the data. When we first started collecting, we saw that daily traffic was down about 41% in Charlotte. And that's kind of the average over everything. And then over the course of the summer, we saw traffic increase to only being down 28%. These trends were fairly similar nationwide. In the early part of the pandemic, traffic was down 43% nationwide. And then as it went along, closer to the summer, it was only down 29%. After the summer, we started to work with the city of Charlotte again to continue our mid-block program with them. We started collecting 15 locations at the beginning of every month. And Keith will get into that data later on in the presentation where he has the results from that. And I thought something that people might be interested in is just the project requests that Quality Counts has received throughout 2020. We're obviously just one firm, but I thought this would be a good proxy for people to see the order activity throughout the pandemic, both locally and nationally. In this chart, it's comparing our North Carolina nationwide orders versus North Carolina and nationwide orders, sorry, versus the past 4 years average. During the summer, you can see North Carolina activity lagged way behind the nation. However, over the course of the last 10 weeks, which was right around the first week of September, you can see the orders have been about 29% less than what they were previously, and that's both for nationwide and for North Carolina. So we've really started to kind of come back to the same trends as the nationwide, which are still down 29%. And as you can see, at least nationwide, our orders have been steadily increasing throughout the fall, and obviously we're hoping that continues. But yeah, so with that, I'll just pass the presentation over to Kerry, who will be going over some of NCDOT's responses during the pandemic.
We can't hear you, Kerry.
Okay, sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. I'm using my phone and it was a little unexpected this morning, so thank you. I was actually just asking if everyone could hear me, so thank you. Thanks, Andy. So I'm just going to go over kind of a snapshot of what we saw on the statewide basis, and to talk a little bit about the data types that we use in our program at NCDOT. So we have short term and we have continuous counters. Obviously, when COVID hit, just like everyone else, it was sort of unexpected and created a big impact to how we do our short-term collection. While we have over 50,000 stations statewide, what we had planned for 2020 for our short-term volume collection, which uses pneumatic tube counters, doing 48-hour counts, we ended up replacing the 24,000 with a sample, which is about going to end up being about 7,000 stations throughout the state. So that we took a big hit in the amount of short-term volume counts that we could do. In terms of our class collection, we did not have to reduce that nearly as much. So we made no adjustments there. Next slide. For interstate collection, we had to make some minor reductions there. 80 interstate control stations down to 47. We're going to have to. We decided to cancel our ramp stations, and so we're going to have to utilize factoring to perform ramp analysis with the mainline control collections in order to get that. And I think a lot remains to be seen about how we end up taking the data that we did collect and using that, applying adjustment factors to make that representative of the entire year for 2020. So we still are kind of figuring that out. But what's going to help us a lot with that is our continuous counters. So we have 95 of those in North Carolina, and those use radar technology. There were no interruptions to that, and so those counters give us 24-hour, 7-day a week, 365 days a year data. We're going to have to heavily utilize that data set in kind of figuring out how we factor all of our other data sets. But one thing that NCDOT leadership asked us to do when COVID hit was to start tracking, or on a weekly basis, start tracking what our traffic was doing, because that had a huge impact on NCDOT and our kind of a revenue stream from gas tax. So we started reporting this weekly. So this slide shows the trends that we found, and a couple of things that I'll note. Keith, if you can advance so we were comparing this to pre-pandemic levels, so to early March. Can you hit the next? Week 5, which was the first week in April. That's where we really saw it kind of peak, or I guess the opposite. We saw the largest decrease in travel patterns statewide. So that was early in the pandemic, week 5. Then week 10 is when we started the sort of reopening of the economy, but it had already been sort of steadily, getting back to normal up to that point. And then, let's see. And then we are on. So this is showing to the end of October, which is week 34. So just to give you sort of a comparison, we've been, really since early June, we've been about even with where we were when we began the pandemic. Next slide. This slide is showing a weekly pattern. So that pre-emergency, that blue line is before COVID hit, and then for comparison, looking at that green line, which is where we are now, we're getting really close to, not quite there, but getting close to that level again. And again, week 5 was sort of that lowest one, and you can see even the pattern, the weekly pattern really changed that during that week. And then week 10 is when we started to open up the economy back up here in North Carolina. Next slide. And then finally, we have sort of a VMT comparison, and so what we're able to do here is just kind of show what we ended up at versus the VMT that was projected forward. And so you can see that as of October 31st, we have 16 billion less vehicle miles traveled in North Carolina than what we had projected originally. So that's kind of just a quick snapshot of the trends that we saw statewide, and I'll pass it back to Keith to talk about Charlotte.
Hey everybody, Keith Bryant with the Charlotte DOT again. We're going to talk a little bit about local data collection efforts. So I'll start with some intersection turning movement counts that we began collecting in March and continued right on to present day. The method we used to collect data at the intersections you saw on the map was Myovision Scout units, and we set those cameras up every month, and we got the data and we had it processed. To sort of show you how the data went, we used 2018 and 2019 counts as our baseline, which is on the far left. Ooh, we got some feedback and someone might need to mute. So the baseline data represents 2018 and 2019 counts. And then as you can see, as you go from left to right, the bottom kind of falls out in March and April. We're down, between 30 and 50% on average. And then May through the summer, we start climbing back closer to baseline. And then where we end up, we stopped in October. And as you can see, there's some outliers above and below, but generally the counts are sort of clustered in that -10 to -30% of baseline. That's sort of where we are today. And I'll show you this on the map. So the purple dot right in the middle of Uptown represents our highest loss. And then everything else around the other geographic locations of the cities, it's just kind of hit or miss. It ranges from being right at to 10% of baseline all the way down to the 30% threshold with the red dots. We want to look at what also is happening, not only with total volume, but what's happening throughout the day. So we'll look at some peak hour diagrams. So here's an example of the Park Fairview Tyvola intersection. On the top, you'll see we counted in September of 2019, and it looks pretty much like a typical intersection peak hour diagram. You have the blue peak in the morning on the left. You have a little bit of a bump in the middle for the midday peak, and then you have another peak in the PM hour around 6 p.m. Look down at the bottom chart and it looks a good bit different. You have basically you're reallocating those trips from the peak hours throughout the remainder of the day, and the lines look completely different. And transposing the 2019 data onto the 2020 data slide, you can see how stark of a difference it is, not only in overall volume, but how those peaks are distributed. So we also took some mid-block counts, and we took 15 of those. And basically what we did was we combined some of the quality counts data that Andy mentioned previously. They collected in the springtime up to the summer, and then there's a little bit of a gap in the summer. And then the city came back in August and started collecting data to the present day. Like NCDOT, we used pneumatic counters, just basically put some tubes down along the routes. And then the chart, the volume chart, is very similar to the intersection turning movement chart. You can see baseline, we're at 0, and then where the bottom falls out, and we're way down in March, April, May. We start climbing back up to the summer, and now things have just sort of settled in. And again, you can see that everything's pretty equally spread among that -10 to -30% range there, with some outliers below and then some outliers that are closer to, actually a little bit above, what our baseline data was. And so here you can see generally what the patterns are between the two, the intersection and the mid blocks. Most of our heaviest losses are in the 277 loop right around uptown, and they just sort of radiate out among the further out into the city. Again, looking at the peak hour data, we took a count station close to the intersection that we looked at, and on the top is October 2018, and on the bottom is October 2020. And you can see basically the AM peak is gone. It's basically a flat line, but then we have similar patterns in the afternoon. It looks like people are starting to get out and about, and not quite to the level that they did before. When we transposed the 2018 data over the 2020 data, you can see the stark contrast in the AM hour, but then things they get close to being back to normal as to what they were in the PM period. Lastly, I wanted to pivot and talk about some pedestrian and bike counts. For the source for this data is our eco counter stations that we have around Charlotte. Want to give a shout out to ITRI, the Institute for Transportation Research and Education. They were able to help us compile some of this data, and they also have 48 continuous ped bike count stations across North Carolina, so give a little plug for them. In Charlotte, we have 10 eco counter locations, and that list is growing. So we took data, here we go, wanted to show you what one of these looked like if you're not familiar with it. You can see the readout totem on the top. This is our South Tryon station, and then on the bottom picture you have the inductive loops in the bike lane there, and then you have the infrared pole on the sidewalk. So that's what one of these looks like. So our Charlotte data, here's a snapshot. These are 5 stations, and let's pick one to kind of look at. Let's look at the orange line. That's our 4-mile Creek Greenway, and it's in orange. So if you look at the dashed line, that represents the 2019 data, and it hovers right around 15,000. And if you look up on the graph, you'll see that orange line, the solid orange line, and that one's hovering close to 35,000 per month. So you basically have over double the usage, and this could be for recreational purposes, or this could also be for transportation purposes. And then as you get further to the right on the graph, you have the lines kind of converging. And wanted to look and just compare that with some of the other data around the state. So ITRI pulled some locations from Raleigh and also from Greensboro, and I'll sort of add that the Raleigh data pretty much followed the pattern that the Charlotte data had. We're seeing close to double the usage on some of their trail facilities. The one outlier I'll point out was Greensboro. This was the Spring Garden Street in counter location in Greensboro. And talking with ITRI, we kind of figured out why the data is kind of inverse of what you would expect. The solid line represents the 2020 data, and the dashed line represents the 2019 data. And why we speculate the difference is that it is near UNC Greensboro, and so you're probably not seeing as much student activity due to the impact that COVID has had on the education system. So with that, we're going to kind of pivot, and we're going to talk about future implications. I'll turn it over to Martin Kinnamon of CDOT Planning to take over.
Thanks, Keith. This is Martin Kinnamon. Like you said, I'm I'm Senior Travel Demand Modeler for the City of Charlotte, and I'm going to be talking about the implications that COVID has on long-range transportation planning. So obviously there's no good time for a global pandemic, but it's happening in the years of 2020 and 2021 really complicates the development of travel models. First off, most models use census years as base years for the models, since we get our most comprehensive demographic information from the census. The census is essential to the development of socioeconomic forecasts. That's half of the input that goes into our travel demand models, which projects population and employment growth in our regions. And the census is also critical to developing sampling plans and expansion factors for any surveys that we do. Now, the 2020 census, the data collection was unusual because pandemic, but we expect relatively modest effects on COVID on the results. For instance, a household income, a number of workers, work location, and size may be different in 2020 than what it was in 2019 and what it may be in the next couple of years when we do our surveys. So we hope when we conduct our household travel survey, our main survey in the next couple of years, that travel behaviors are back to normal. But we won't know how congruous this is with the census data that is gathered. So we take the information from the census and our surveys, and we create equations that describe how, when, and where, what time of day, what mode people travel with. And those equations last us for 10 years until we do next surveys. So we hope that travel behaviors are somewhat stable when we do our surveys, but we're not totally sure. The practice in modeling is then to validate the model by comparing to our forecast model or our travel demand model to traffic counts. But as we've seen in previous slides, the base year 2020 traffic counts are somewhat problematic. So in validation, when it comes to validating our model, we'll be using some combination of older, newer counts that don't really align with the data, our base year data. Okay. So not to get into the weeds of travel modeling, but want to emphasize that these models are a major tool in the development of our MTPs, upon which our region's long-term design and funding decisions are established. So here I've included a extremely simplified example of how this might affect real-life decisions. So in this equation here, we're assuming the model is showing a 50% growth on a particular roadway. Again, that 50% growth is somewhat questionable because of just talked about. But if we didn't use that growth rate on a traffic volume that's all for whatever reason, that could be the difference between whether we recommend or see a need for this example, a 4-lane road or a 2 or 3-lane road. And that decision is millions of dollars. And that's just 24-hour volumes. So like Keith showed in one of the previous examples, the peak hour volumes are even more critical and problematic. Okay, so the COVID impacts is just one of several uncertainties that developers of travel models are facing. So telecommuting, which is being enhanced and changed rapidly by COVID, was already happening, but we don't know if that trend is going to continue. And Bastian will talk about this a little bit later. Connecting autonomous vehicles, that affects not only the capacity of our roadways, but how people actually travel. Rapid transit, a shift to scooters, bikes, and other micro mobilities. E-commerce, all of these suggest a future for travel that is quite different from how it is today. And then the big takeaway from this is our models are facing a lot of uncertainty in the future. So since there's such uncertainty in travel behaviors moving forward, the trend in modeling is to investigate the impacts of different alternatives and to provide a range of outcomes. So instead of having one forecasted volume in the future, we'll probably have a range of volumes. And that's something just is probably more true to how things, what the model is going to say. So in one way that the CRTPO is dealing with these issues is as far as their MTP process for their 2050 MTP, they're adding a scenario planning component. And we're looking at 3 different types of scenarios. One is lane use. So there is kind of a more centralized version, and then all the way to kind of more decentralized, and there's the suburban. Telecommuting, for that scenario, we're focusing only on the capacity of roadways, and so kind of more penetration of connected autonomous vehicles in the more aggressive scenarios, and then telecommuting. So what we've done is we've looked at different rates of telecommuting for jobs that people are more apt to be able to work from home from. And so this is, we've streamlined this process, but still, and for this is 27 different model runs. Takes a lot of computing power, but hopefully it'll give us some interesting and informative ranges of output. Okay, and now we'll move on to Bastian, who's going to talk about big pictures.
So to close out, just a few thoughts on where we go from here, right? So we've looked a lot of historical data. Martin has talked a little bit about implications for modeling. So here's just a couple of slides from a recent survey that Kittelson did, a commuter survey of just over 1,000 participants, a little bit biased towards the transportation industry, but more than half of participants responded that if it were up to them, they would like to work from home moving forward. So I think people found, a new normal, and so there's at least some indication that they're interested in keeping that up. We then asked them also about, would your employers support that on the next slide? And 75% said that their employers would be willing or very willing to really support telecommuting. So there's some reason to believe that really some of these trends we're seeing will be sustained. Certainly a lot will depend presumably on the school schedules, and I think that drives what a lot of families are doing in the mornings and whether there's an AM peak or not. But certainly really a momentum, not just in the US, but really globally on working from home. We're hearing that some European countries are already doing telecommuting 2-3 days a week, even pre-COVID, and that's sustained. So to close out, just, and Martin has covered much of this, but as we're thinking as an industry of really our forecasting activities, so thinking of trip generation, what are the work from home implications, and what are the increase in discretionary trips? So we saw the, almost a peak spreading, right? So the AEDT is only down by 10%. The AM peak hour is down by 30 or 40%. So that means people don't have to get up in the morning, but then they have flexibility throughout the day. So the ADT numbers and then the impacts on the peak hour. So going from a K factor that might traditionally be a 0.1 or 0.11, 10 or 11%, that number dropping to a K factor of 0.08 is a tremendous impact on our trip generation and really, our traffic impact analyses and everything there. So that to me is probably the #1 trend that we really need to pay close attention to as an industry, what those peaking characteristics are. And then more broadly speaking, on our last slide here is just general implications for the transportation industry, right? So we saw evidence for increased multimodal focus, right? So the increase in walking and bicycling demand, and really understanding those. Also, a lot of urban areas have seen increases in walking and bicycle crashes. So there's something that we have to pay attention to. Signal timing. Traditionally, we're looking at AM and PM peak hour plans plans and then an off-peak plan, maybe that is not relevant anymore. Maybe there's just a need for greater flexibility and responsiveness of our traffic signals. And then finally, transit and micromobility. So the slides that I started out with, the impact on traditional transit, so crowded buses, crowded metros, and is that being replaced with microtransit, or is it being replaced with micromobility, or is it being replaced with work from home? So a lot still to be learned. And so probably a really big need to continuously monitor the travel trends and, really looking at the NCDOT data, the City of Charlotte data, as well as other statewide resources to really keep a close eye on how these patterns recover, especially to me as schools open up again. I think that will drive a lot of what all of us working do on a day-to-day basis. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Bastian, and thank you for all the speakers. Unfortunately, we're running a few minutes behind, so we're going to hold the questions and try to revisit them after all the presentations. Our second presenter is Sarah Brown. The topic is mobility justice. Sarah is a master's student in City and Regional Planning Department at UNC Chapel Hill. She has an undergraduate degree in civil engineering and also in professional writing. She has been a research assistant at UNC Highway Safety Research Center, focusing on pedestrian and bicycle safety research. Sarah is passionate about mobility justice and anti-racist work in the transportation profession. Her Dwight D. Eisenhower Transportation Fellowship will focus on analyzing enforcement and police involvement in active transportation programs. She's going to graduate in May 2021. To everyone, please type your questions into the chat window and use the questions window for any technical questions. Sarah, the screen is yours.
Yeah, Lauren, could you share for me?
Yeah, trying to get that shared for you.
Thank you.
Sure, hold on. All right. Are you seeing that in presenter mode though? Okay, are you good now?
Yeah, okay, yeah, that looks great. So yeah, thank you for that introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here today to talk to you about mobility justice. And before I start, I really want to highlight that this is a collection of others' work. It's not my own. Most of the work that I'm sharing today has been done by a lot of great leaders in the transportation field that identify as Black, Indigenous, people of color, as well as members of the LGBTQIA+ community. And I am really here to raise those voices and give gratitude to those in the field who are actively doing this really important work. And sources and who to connect with more about these topics will be linked at my end of my presentation. Next. Next slide. Oh, thanks. Okay, so this is just an overview of what I'll be talking about. I'll be exploring some of the disparate impacts that we see in transportation across different intersectional identities, and then I'll explore the concept of mobility justice, how we define it, and lay out some of the principles that we can use to begin to reflect on and understand where our work as engineers and planners fits into that. And then I can explore some next step for planners and engineers as well. And then I'll connect to sources and who you can follow on social media to engage with these concepts further. Next. So this is a call to action that I like to start with when engaging with built environment professions and talking about how our work connects to social justice movements. This is a quote that really speaks to framing why is this urgent. It's important to name who has taught you how to look at whiteness and privilege and to show up as a better ally. And one person that sticks out to me is Amina Yassine, who is the co-chair of the Canadian Institute of Planners Social Equity Committee. And so in June 2020, Yassine posed this call to action in her piece titled "Who Streets, Black Streets?" in response to the killing of Black and brown bodies in public space by police. And I like reading this quote because I think it's very powerful. So I'm inviting all of us in urbanism fields, especially those who espouse cities for all and open streets for people of all ages, abilities, and backgrounds, to consider why Black people are harassed and dying in public spaces while jogging, riding their bicycles, walking, playing, birdwatching in the park, having a barbecue, just existing in public space, or even, yes, driving their cars. And so marginalized groups and those with intersectional identities, including those of the BIPOC and LGBTQ+ community, experience racism, oppression, and targeted violence while moving around public space. And this comes in the form of policing a public space, which is typically got by police officers or vigilantes. And if people are dying on the streets and in the public spaces that we have designed and we have planned, we have to recognize that something is terribly wrong, and our work is directly tied to that. Our professional lives in transportation boil down to being of service to others. They are directly tied to the lives of people, and as Amina is capturing, it extends beyond safety defined as crashes. Racism and oppression directly impact how people move around communities and the various modes of mobility, including cars, bikes, transit, walking, etc. Next slide. So I'm going to briefly go over some data on the disparate impacts of mode usage to try to paint this bigger picture of what I'm getting at. Different socioeconomic identities impact whether you drive, you walk, bike, or take transit. According to federal level travel data, Black people are about 30% more likely than white people to rely on walking. People who live in poverty take about 50% more walking trips than those who have higher incomes. And Black and Hispanic people are twice as likely as white people to live in poverty. Black and Hispanic people are also much more likely to take transit than white people, and Black people use transit at a rate 3 times more than white people. And lastly, Latinx people are twice as likely to lack access to a car as white people. And this is not an exhaustive list of data by any means. This is just some snapshots that have been documented in Angie Smith's new book, Right of Way, that I encourage all of you to check out. It just came out. But these inequalities are significant and reflect how root causes of systemic racism and oppression throughout history continue to manifest today. Next slide. Now I'm going to explore some disparate impacts in crash data, which is impacted by the design of the built environment. And so walking deaths fall disproportionately on those who are poor, Black or brown, elderly, disabled, low income, or some combination thereof. Intersectional identities of marginalized people with few political resources. Black and Hispanic men are about twice as likely to be killed while walking or biking as white men, and Black and Hispanic men are 4 times more likely to be killed than the general population. But even though additional exposure and usage do play a role in these disparities, it does not fully capture or explain why Black and brown people are much more likely to be killed. The general acceptance of these deaths as tragic but inevitable blatantly avoids the necessary work of recognizing solutions and finding the will to implement them. And so understanding the systemic causes is the first step to saving lives. It's likely that these people are living and therefore walking, biking, and driving in environments where the conditions are riskier, where the streets are designed with higher speeds and more lanes to cross. People living in neighborhoods of color have historically received different treatment than white neighborhoods, which is documented through the legacy of redlining and urban renewal, which I will touch on later. And these neighborhoods have been disinvested in, and we've seen highways have been plowed through them or other large arterials in the name of greater throughput or better levels of service. So summing all that up, we are seeing design play out in inequalities and fatal crashes and serious injuries. Next slide. Okay, the last disparate impacts I want to touch on are the policing of the built environment. There's a long and growing research record detailing the magnitude of racial profiling, bias policing, and police-based violence and the impacts on safety and the health of Black pedestrians, bicyclists, and drivers. More and more data is becoming available on the racism and oppression and walking and biking of Black people by police. So touching on walking a little bit, the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Trayvon Martin, and Mike Brown were a result of Black people being targeted while walking or jogging in public space. In Jacksonville, Florida, over a 5-year period, 55% of tickets were issued to Black individuals, even though only 29% of the total population identify as Black. Thinking about biking, in Chicago, the Chicago Tribune reported how not a single white area ranked in the top 10 for bicycling tickets despite its popularity in white areas. And between 2003 and 2015, Tampa police issued over 10,000 tickets. 79% were issued to Black people, while only 26% of Tampa's population identifies as Black. Tampa police typically target poor Black neighborhoods for citations, such as riding with no light or carrying a friend on the handlebars. Lastly, diving into driving a little bit, discretionary stops differ from stops for traffic safety violations because of the high level of subjectivity by police. Black and Latinx drivers are stopped disproportionately to white drivers. And it's well known that police are less likely to pull over Black drivers after dusk when the race of the driver is less obvious to police. A state commission study in Minnesota found that Black and Latinx populations were 7 times more likely to be stopped by police in white majority neighborhoods. And we have seen that discretionary stops exhibit widespread racial disparities. Black drivers account for a disproportionate share of these stops. But however, we know these widespread stops by police have no proven traffic safety benefit. And again, this is not an exhaustive list of data, but today there is still disparate stopping, ticketing, and arresting of drivers, bicyclists, and pedestrians. Next slide. Okay, so when getting into how usage, crashes, and policing all fit in together, one cohesive concept is arrested mobility. Charles T. Brown of Rutgers University presented his work on arrested mobility and how federal, state, and local initiatives, plans, and programs aim to increase the physical activity of Black people in the US, but fail to achieve the removal of barriers of racism, oppression, and police brutality in public space. And he defines arrested mobility is assertion that Black people and other minorities have been historically and presently denied by legal and illegal authority the inalienable right to move, to be moved, or to simply exist in public space, resulting in adverse social, political, economic, and health effects that are widespread, preventable, and intergenerational. Charles talks about how Black mobility has been arrested in personal, interpersonal, institutional, and cultural realms. And he poses the question of, do any of the programs in transportation and traffic safety, which are typically led by engineers and planners, actually help eliminate problems for Black people? And he gives a short answer of no, because strategies are currently apolitical and ahistorical. They have been complacent in discriminatory law enforcement and ask police to be a part of traffic safety, even though we have data on the lack of effectiveness of deterrence theory, and no, we can't enforce our way out of a design problem. We also have unconscious bias and criminalization of Blackness, still heavily integrated into the transportation profession. And so in many ways, our profession chooses to stay apolitical and ahistorical, and for a long time, we have been complacent in racism and have chosen to ignore the ways our profession can show up. But arrested mobility and mobility justice are emerging as a refusal to accept or be a part of that reality. And so now that I painted that picture, I'm transitioning specifically to talk about mobility justice. It demands that safety and equitable mobility address not only the construction of streets, but the socioeconomic, cultural, and discriminatory barriers to access and comfort different communities experience within public spaces. Mobility justice is used to name these intersectional unsafeties and the attacks that people from marginalized groups experience in public spaces, such as streets, transit systems, and the governance processes that lay claim to regulate those spaces. So when we say marginalized groups, we mean Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, people with disabilities, immigrants, trans people, queer people, women, and youth. Mobility injustices include the policing against Black bodies, the persecution and incarceration of undocumented families, gender-based violence and harassment, racism, ableism, and tokenism in transportation planning, policy, and advocacy. Mobility injustices also occur during gentrification, which transportation is heavily tied to. It also plays out in having no choice but to go to work during a global pandemic and traveling 2 hours each way on public transit. And these experiences lead to isolation and fear rather than the freedom and independence that is preached as the future of sustainable mobility and access to different modes. Mobility justice acknowledges that safety is different for different people and should be defined by those most economically and legally vulnerable. And advocates for mobility justice believe it can be achieved through targeted investment in and innovation by these marginalized groups that free people to move easily, fairly, and unafraid. And we have to shift focus from the modes of transportation people use to the bodies and the identities of the people using those modes by centering the experiences of these individuals and the most vulnerable communities. Next slide. Okay, so I want to focus the rest of this presentation on the untokening and their mobility justice teachings and principles that they have for us within the transportation and built environment professions. The Untokening is a collective that focuses on mobility justice, and they have conferences and gatherings around the country. The last one to date was in our very own Durham, North Carolina. It was run by Ideal Ortiz, who is an amazing community engagement leader and researcher, and she is also a member of the Durham BPAC. For a long time, dominant narratives in mobility advocacy have drawn from the experiences of the most privileged, typically white. The Untokening centers the lives of experiences of people who are leaders from marginalized identities, as well as people who are actively engaging, organizing, and advocating in diverse communities. And the Untokening creates a safe space for those with diverse intersectional identities to show up as their full selves and connect and collaborate to further justice work in transportation. The Untokening recommendations for our field are rooted in the liberation of historically marginalized communities instead of offering ready-made solutions, and I will go through the eight of them for the rest of the presentation. Next slide. Okay, so the first principle is to seek to repair harm, not erase history. And so the United States has a history of redlining and urban renewal. Briefly, redlining was a practice done by the federal government in the 1930s to create maps that characterize neighborhoods as best, still desirable, declining, or hazardous. Race of residents played a major role in determining which neighborhoods were deemed best and which were hazardous, with Black neighborhoods typically being graded the lowest. This led to historical disinvestment and impacts on generational wealth. And we also need to reconcile with urban renewal, which was led by the engineering and planning professions. Urban renewal is a process where properties were purchased or taken by eminent domain and then given to developers for new uses. And renewal areas targeted Black, low-income, and other diverse communities as undesirable places to live. And as a result, they built highways and rail through these areas and destroyed the built and social fabric of communities by taking homes away from people and displacing people. And so both of these have led to the cultural erasure of certain identities in cities. And mobility justice demands that we fully excavate, recognize, and reconcile this history and the current injustices experienced by communities. And it calls for impacted communities to be given space and resources to envision and implement their own planning models and political advocacy. So what can we do as engineers and planners? We can seek to understand how oppressed communities have survived and thrived in spite of systemic neglect, and how these most vulnerable populations continue to struggle because of structural inequalities. Next slide. The next principle is identity influences vulnerability. I've touched on this one a lot throughout the presentation, so I'm going to keep this slide pretty brief. But when people live at the intersection of multiple vectors of oppression, uninhibited access to mobility and public space are not guaranteed. Safety is more than protection from cars. Bodies encounter different risks and have different needs. Racism, sexism, classism, ableism, xenophobia, and homophobia, and constraints imposed upon gender non-conforming folks can make the public space very hostile to many. And so what can we do as engineers and planners? We can address barriers to mobility and explore why people choose the modes that they do and tackle a wider range of barriers to mobility. We can also recognize oppressive systems of ableism, toxic masculinity, and white supremacy, that undermine the free expression of marginalized communities and perpetuate narrow approaches to street safety that fuel inequities and exclusion. Next slide. Okay, the third one is prioritizing people over profit, property, or placemaking. Segregation and gentrification provide economic benefits to privileged populations, both historically and today. And they define what counts as development, while those who bear the hidden costs are overruled or silenced through displacement. Those reaping the financial, cultural, and infrastructural benefits of gentrification are complicit in perpetuating oppression. And mobility justice prioritizes the community's lived experiences and aspirations as the primary driver of change and progress. It recognizes the significance of human infrastructure and ensures new projects enhance rather than erase or displace existing communities. So what can we do as engineers and planners? Successful development should be defined by effects on people, not economic efficiency. Benefits of neighborhood changes must benefit those who live in the community and historically have experienced the most neglect. Sustainable and equitable mobility projects take place, or they should take place in landscapes where profit sharing models are plentiful. Next slide. Next is seeing structural barriers. Streets, infrastructure, and transportation are intimately tied to the human experience. For many, mobility is shaped deliberately by designed barriers, including the use of highways or rail lines to divide and destroy communities, and the stigmatization of transportation methods used by low-income communities of color. This principle examines the context and options available to communities and what investments beyond street infrastructure would make more sustainable modes of transit more tenable. And what can we do as engineers and planners? Until many of the past wrongs and inequities are addressed, pursuit of mobility justice may involve looking beyond individual choices about transportation modes and looking at the deeply related issues such as housing instability, job options, and over-policing. And some of the changes that we can make are changes in policing, better bus schedules, lower fares, housing affordability, and dignity-oriented engagement. Next slide. Number 4, discard best practices, respond to local needs. Social movements oriented towards streets and mobility prioritize planning models and political advocacy without addressing the community's distrust of government systems, which is valid when we look at history. And we see the use of colonial, oppressive, or inaccessible language and designs and ideas that are just exported Eurocentric best practices rather than responding to local needs. Mobility justice aims to decenter Eurocentric solutions as the default model and looks toward dynamic grassroots approaches and solutions that are elsewhere, such as South and Central America and Southeast Asia. And it demands language justice and information access that does not exclude people through professional, technical, or academic jargon that can be difficult to understand. And so what can we do as engineers and planners? We must find peers in places where the vulnerable and marginalized communities feel comfortable having power. And these community leaders must have access to conferences and information and be exposed to different people and perspectives and gain support once they're sitting at our table. Next slide. Oh, are you here? So this one is value community voices as essential data. Qualitative data is powerful. However, the experiences and input of marginalized communities are often disputed or disbelieved by institutions of power. Decision makers rely on quantitative data collected and framed from the perspective of the privileged, which actively rejects the knowledge and erases the struggle and contributions of community residents. Mobility justice demands that the lived experiences of community members be given priority as data in assessing infrastructure and investment needs, while also accounting for the deep and lasting trauma from the erasure of social, cultural, and economic networks. And so what can engineers and planners do? We can respect and value the assets inherent and abundant in marginalized communities rather than their deficiencies, and develop data tools that serve the current community rather than transform it for others. We can also value the local knowledge of these communities and compensate them for sharing that wisdom. Next slide. Number 6 is co-creating new decision-making processes. Communities are often told that civic participation must take place within spaces and frameworks that are built on white supremacy and are designed to benefit and empower those with privilege. Inviting marginalized communities to those decision-making tables puts them at an inherent disadvantage and reinforces white-centered constraints. Mobility justice recognizes that these communities are often treated as if they're unfit or to design their own futures, guide public spending, or understand the real issues at hand. So what can we do? We can make new decision-making systems and structures that are created by and for those communities. And we can meet people where they are and embrace full leadership. Next slide. I talked about this one already today, but we can reject policing as a street safety solution. It's built on a history of explicit racism, prioritizes the life and property of white communities while criminalizing and traumatizing our BIPOC community. Policing has long acted as a partner to segregate and make public space unwelcoming, unsafe, and deadly. So what can we do as engineers and planners? Advocates and practitioners should align with transformative justice spaces and organizations that focus on alternatives to policing, and we can strengthen those partnerships within transportation. Next slide. Okay, this is the last one. Lastly, we can address environmental racism. Throughout history, the public sector has disconnected many urban communities from green spaces and have disproportionately created toxic environments. Today, infrastructure improvements like bike lanes and green space often result in environmental gentrification as long-time and lower-income residents are priced out. Mobility justice integrates environmental justice principles to address health disparities, displacement, and disconnection from the future. So what can we do? Communities have the right to demand and expect healthy environments and equal access to the benefits of green space and remediation of past environmental harms. And advocates must critically examine the implementation of sustainable development so that healthier environments aren't active agents of displacement or cultural erasure. Next slide. So in conclusion, wrapping up here are some key takeaways. Transportation is not neutral. Safety is more than just protection from cars. We have to recognize how mobility of Black folks has been arrested. Ultimately, transportation needs to understand we are of service to others rather than ourselves. We are the facilitator of ideas from the community, not just inserting our own best practices as a one-size-fits-all solution. And we need to discard the notion that only one group can gain and the other loses. This unlearning can make cross-community collaboration powerful and lead toward justice and collaboration. Next slide. So this is not an exhaustive list, but these are primarily the BIPOC folks on Twitter that I follow, and I'm putting them here so you can connect with them and learn from them. I look to them for guidance or clarity when I'm working on my own research projects or doing peg bike research. Next slide. And then here's sources. Next slide. And then next. Okay, so yeah, that's all I have. I know that was a lot, so thank you for staying with me. Final thoughts. It's time to get uncomfortable. That's when the best learning will happen. My email is here if you want to connect with me and we can sidebar about any of these topics that I touched on today. Also, I want to plug the UNC Chapel Hill student chapter is having an event that I'm moderating on November 19th. Follow up with me if you want to get connected to that. I think the link was sent out because I've seen some folks from Nick's site signing up already, which makes me really happy. So yeah, that's all I have for you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That was a great presentation. We have our third presentation ready to go. It's freight, logistics, plus transportation. The future is now. And our speaker is Dana Magliola. Dana Magliola is a senior supply chain analyst leading the NCDOT's Office of Logistics plus Freight. Magliola joined NCDOT in 2018 from NC State University, where he led the Supply Chain Resource Cooperative at Poole College of Management. He's a graduate of the University of Virginia. Beyond transportation, Magliola is also the longtime head coach of the NC State sailing team and speaks regularly on leadership beyond athletics to a wide spectrum of audiences. Just a reminder for the audiences, please type all your questions into the chat window. Mr. Magliola, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. You should be able to see my title slide, and we're going to jump right into things. Thanks to the North Carolina section of the Institute of Transportation Engineers. I'm sorry to butcher the title. I think it was NCDOT is how everybody says it. But thank you for having me today and sharing the presentation, Freight Logistics and Supply Chain, the Future is Now. To start, I'll introduce myself. My name is Dana Magliola, and as you heard, I'm the Senior Supply Chain Analyst in NCDOT's Office of Logistics and Freight. I serve as the Supply Chain Logistics and Freight Subject Matter Expert here at NCDOT and Project Manager on related projects. My background is in maritime, freight forwarding, and applied supply chain and operations research. Today, I work to align all that we do at NCDOT with the industrial, commercial, and economic realities in the communities we serve. Today, I'll provide you with an overview of key issues in freight and logistics and identify some ways in which things are changing and how that'll affect the future. Bear with me, guys. I'm trying to move these screens out of the way. I'd like to start with a bit of philosophy, though, or more honestly, a threat. These two quotes, I think, really capture a bit of my worldview when it comes to how we look at data and freight analysis in the DOT space. The DOTs that focus on older models will be unprepared to serve the new kinds of demand. A quote from McKinsey. And I love that you can pick up that same theme in the presentations we heard from Keith and his team earlier, and then from Sarah earlier. The older models are not going to suit the future. And then data is the new oil. Great quote by the economist. If you don't have data to back up what you're saying, I think you're shouting into the void. And I think Sarah rightfully points out that our data sources are even biased. I like to think about how we can change that in our space. But let's talk about freight and let's define freight. Freight can be everything from an intermodal container that you see on a train or the back of a chassis. It could be full of merchandise, or it could be the smallest e-commerce package. And freight is really everything in between. It is the physical manifestation of economic activity, and it's diverse and it's constantly moving. The US DOT estimates that the transportation system moved over 54 million tons of goods worth nearly $48 billion each day. That's almost 63 tons of freight per person per year. And we're looking at a sharp increase in that over the next 20 years, with tonnage forecast to increase by 45% by 2040. So I'd like to introduce two other concepts in our space, and that is supply chain and logistics. Now, we all know about the supply chain because of toilet paper. That is the stocked shelves that we've found at grocery stores a couple weeks into the pandemic. That is a testament to the supply chain. It is the flow of material, information, and funds across the production of goods and across the production of services, really. Logistics, on the other hand, is the strategic operational execution of activities within the supply chain. And you'll see I've listed here some examples that give you an idea of specifically what would be qualified as logistics. So warehousing, distribution, packaging, and then of course like return logistics. You'll hear that phrase. I like these basic analogies. Supply chain management is the coach, logistics is the quarterback, and freight is the football. But let me also provide you with some economic context for the supply chain, some figures that help to articulate its importance to North Carolina. You're talking about, at a conceptual level, the supply chain cycles consumer goods and services from procurement and sourcing through delivery. At the industrial level, we're viewing things as more of an ecosystem of manufacturers, suppliers, transportation providers, and included in that, the physical, technological, and information infrastructure on which these things operate. The supply chain is no small part of our economy. In North Carolina, this contributes directly more than $85.5 billion annually, not to mention employing nearly 500,000 North Carolinians directly, putting more than $32 billion into state and local federal coffers in tax. Now, I like to focus on direct numbers in an economic analysis. You'll often hear those indirect and induced numbers quoted. So if you even look at a conservative approach of direct, these are big, significant impacts. To give you an idea of which industrial sectors are included in the analysis, you'll see the sector rankings of the 14 supply chain sectors in order by GDP contribution here on the right of the slide. So at the risk of using corporate jargon, we can identify several important change agents in the supply chain, or more simply put, major shifts in technology, economic behavior, or societal dynamics that are changing how we produce and consume the goods and services we consume today. One key technology disruptor is the rapid growth, development, and application of drones in the supply chain. And although it doesn't match this estimate here on this article from the late 1950s, where they predict a missile expert predicts rocket mail by 1965. Sadly, we didn't make that, but we're seeing it realized in a different environment through drones. This change agent holds more potential for disruption than it's actually having on the economy currently, but there are significant efforts underway to find new use cases for drones or unmanned aerial systems. This includes the often cited package delivery application, but drones are relevant to far more than sort of that Amazon package to your door. They're relevant to fulfillment, inventory management, cargo handling, data collection, inspection and cataloging, as well as operational and facility design optimization. All of these applications are relevant for a UAS. Drones are also on wheels and a growing area of interest, and one we may see sooner rather than later. You've got integrators like UPS and FedEx already running pilots on drone cart delivery, and even Domino's is getting into the game with their little pizza robot, which has been pulled up. One of the key foundational technologies that supports drone development and application, as well as a host of other innovations, is the application of artificial intelligence, or AI. Whether it's IBM's Watson predicting weather patterns for supply chain planning, or the application of machine learning and algorithms to determine effective marketing and distribution practices, AI and the overall maturation of big data analytics will support industry innovation and change over the coming years. These changes will most definitely impact transportation, and we will have to be prepared today to not only shift how we do things, but also find ways to apply these technologies to our activities from planning to design to construction. Another popular and significant disruptor in the supply chain and transportation space is connected and autonomous vehicles. There will surely be a future when our car drives us to the store, but more likely in the short term, connected and autonomous vehicles will find widespread application and adoption in the commercial sector. Companies with large fleets facing driver shortages and an aging workforce in the trucking industry will expedite adoption. There's already major investment in electric trucks from companies like Walmart and Amazon for semi-trucks produced by companies like Tesla and Nikola. CAVs and AI will help improve fleet asset utilization, and I'm a firm believer that economic incentive is a powerful driver for change. Without the economic case, little happens. Improvements in safety and control make CAV technologies more relevant to transit, as well as where controlling costs and improving efficiencies will pay dividends to urban transit systems, those that can leverage that technology. NCDOT's CASI is a great example of a transit-oriented CAV in its pilot stages. And I'm excited that I think we've got a new deployment of this CASI, which was, I think, derailed a little bit by COVID after some initial deployments on NC State's Centennial campus. Policy changes are important to enable the application and use of disruptive technologies. And when we look at the CAV or ACV space, since 2012, more than 40 states and the District of Columbia have introduced or enacted legislation relating to ACVs. Executive orders are also at play in some states, such as Executive Order 80 here in North Carolina, which is more focused on electrification and carbon reduction. In the UAS space, the integrated pilot program here, the IPP you've heard about, active in North Carolina over the past 2 years, has enabled innovative applications of drones across the state. And you see pilots in businesses like WakeMed in Raleigh or the Baptist Health Network in Winston-Salem, where drones are being applied to moving high-grade and high-value medical supplies across these hospital campuses. Drones are being investigated for other industrial applications, and you hear regularly, more recently we got a waiver to use them for bridge inspections. It's also relevant to crane inspection in the maritime environment. Another major consideration is the electrification of the transportation grid. With advances in battery technology, consumer market adoption of electric vehicles, and even government mandates, like I mentioned with Executive Order 80 here in North Carolina, transportation's future will be tied closely with the electrical power grid and infrastructure. Together with increased application for electric power and the very real concern over climate change, wind power and green energy are an important disruptor in the transportation space and the supply chain. In North Carolina, this disruptor will not only be a demand for more green energy, but will actually provide economic and supply chain development opportunities as we see wind power, both onshore and offshore, sectors mature in our region. This is a huge opportunity for North Carolina. I love this illustration by Klaus Bergel, who was a retro futurist artist in the 50s and 60s, that describes these large flying power plants at high altitude and the cable ropes that connect them. You know, we're not that far off from this if you think about turbines. Now let's talk about the huge disruptor, and I'm glad you heard about it in the first presentation as a disruptor, and that is e-commerce. It is not only a change agent in transportation and global supply chains, but pretty much the very fabric of how we operate as a society. The pandemic itself has accelerated e-commerce growth and adoption in the United States and beyond. And here's some outstanding statistics. We will exceed $794 billion in sales, in e-commerce sales in 2020. A growth rate of 32% on last year, and some areas where you see like online grocery shopping have more than doubled in 2 years. When you look at the numbers excluding gas and auto sales, e-commerce penetration rate reaches more than 20% of all US retail spending. And even auto sales are growing online, and you see this with the success of companies like CarMax, and I think there's some other online. At the same time, we've also seen a 3.2% decline in brick and mortar retail spending this year, dropping that figure to still a whopping $4.7 trillion. The market itself is consolidating. However, with the top 10 e-commerce firms accounting for more than 63% of all online sales last year, top 10 companies in e-commerce control more than 63% of the volume online. And Amazon, with the lion's share of that at 39%, followed very far behind with Walmart at 5.8%. Companies in the top 10 like Target and Best Buy have seen e-commerce sales more than double this year, 103% and 105% respectively, largely based on the popularity of their curbside pickup programs. And I know I was out, I did some curbside pickup at Target this weekend the first time and said, this is pretty awesome. And you know, you don't get to meander around the store and make impulse purchases, but I think it's going to be rapidly adopted, even beyond COVID. So let's talk a little bit about e-commerce, and the major driver here in that supply chain environment is the customer and consumer focus on shipping cost and speed. You know, expectations of free next day shipping are the starting point for most online retailers. Now, I mean, how many on the call today find themselves in the top 2 categories on this poll here on the right, where with shipping options as a factor in your purchasing? I often lecture to student groups and in the university setting, and I like to ask them who during the span of this class has ordered something online, and inevitably at least a hand goes up. The more hands go up, the less I know I have their attention. Another expectation driven in part by the proliferation of online purchasing, but enabled by technology, is visibility. Visibility not just in delivery of consumer goods, but all across the supply chain. In cities and towns, growth and urbanization is shifting how companies serve consumer demand, and short window delivery demand and volume is shifting the distribution network design. There's a lot of moving parts here. We see a shift away from large DCs, large distribution centers outside of the urban beltline, to smaller, more agile warehousing and fulfillment centers right in the urban core. You know, these changes are front and center for urban transportation planning, land use policy and practices, and a major concern for transportation safety professionals and planners. The next disruptor is no stranger for anyone on today's virtual webinar-based conference, right? The fact that we're calling this a virtual webinar-based conference, we would not have predicted that last year. We're all Zooming or on Teams constantly, and the shift in working patterns has a major transportation implications. I love that we got a preview of that with Keith's presentation earlier and really saw some amazing numbers. From morning commutes to rush hours, we're all wondering what the post-COVID world will look like and what changes that we've adopted now that will stick around. I found this in a German postmodern illustration book, and I just thought it was shocking that this is like a Zoom call minus the cigarette, right? But this was what was kind of predicted in the 60s to be probably what they said in the year 2000. We're all online for work, but beyond being online for work, many sectors face an aging workforce, especially in manufacturing and some areas of transportation, such as trucking. These factors will expedite and accelerate the application of other disruptive technologies like AI and CAVs. In today's supply chain, visibility and predictability become competitive advantages. Leveraging technologies and practices such as the Internet of Things, IoT, or the myriad of shared ledger blockchain type platforms, industrial and commercial supply chains are much more transparent today. I like too that supply chain transparency can provide a business benefit, but it also helps us recognize some of the impact of supply chain manufacturing and transportation on the countries in the supply chain where we see substandard labor practices or things like that. I don't know that that ties directly into Sarah's presentation, but we have to be aware, I think, of the social impact of our sector. In the manufacturing space, the culmination of a lot of disruptors can be seen in what's called Manufacturing 4.0 or Industry 4.0. This concept highlights the ongoing automation of traditional manufacturing and industrial practices using modern smart technology. With efficiencies and improvements possible under this now fourth industrial revolution, protecting supply chains and intellectual property becomes even more important. We see cybersecurity as a top concern of nearly every C-level executive in the U.S. industry today, and it should be a major consideration for the transportation sector as we start to see technology, as we continue to see technology involved and infiltrate and implemented in our space. Lastly, an extension of the e-commerce concept is the proliferation of AaaS, as a service activities, software as a service, cloud computing as a service, transportation as a service. All of these are familiar to many of you, especially if you've ever taken an Uber. But I want to highlight one that's closely tied to the disruption we see today with COVID, or in the recent past, major storms or natural disasters. Disaster recovery as a service, so leaping into action in the event of a catastrophe to save network data, infrastructure, and applications, is one of the quickest expanding markets in the as-a-service marketplace, expected to grow from 1.7 billion in 2016 to more than 12 billion by 2022. I think that just tells how important the resiliency conversation, the conversation around recovery has become, not just in the supply chain space, but it's no stranger to the conversations we have in transportation. Some more shifting supply chain dynamics I'll talk a little bit about are more of the macroeconomic trend we consider with reshoring or nearshoring to support supply chain resiliency. Again, that resiliency concept. In the COVID pandemic, this became mainstream consideration And although some firms will retain a global footprint, inventory management practices, especially in sourcing and procurement, they're increasing safety stock at the expense of working capital. You know, that stock that's on the shelf is money that can't be spent elsewhere or reinvested. That hinders reinvestment when that's tied up, and it reduces the overall efficiency of the industrial economy. We're letting go of efficiencies we've gained over many years of practices like just-in-time, Kanban manufacturing, lean manufacturing techniques. Over the past 4 years, we've also seen protectionist tariffs and trade policy and political instability further complicate the already shifting regulatory landscape of international trade. Supply chain planning is proactively seeking ways to mitigate this risk and exposure to tariffs or political whims. That's a major thing to think about in the operational space. Along the same lines, we've seen a shift away from China as a primary producer for many sectors, driven not so much by tariffs and bluster, but by the economic incentive afforded by low-cost labor in regions like Southeast Asia or India. These shifts have major implications for the global supply chain, and they will resonate locally and regionally here in North Carolina. Another major trend to note is the rising demand and limited supply of temperature-controlled storage and transportation. Major growth in online grocery and pharma sectors. We're seeing this demand increase, and then you throw into the mix the potential of the need for a temperature-controlled infrastructure around a COVID vaccine. And this is a major challenge, but also an opportunity for North Carolina. For example, we're seeing significant investment from North Carolina ports and economic development near the port and near intermodal facilities that are positioning North Carolina in a great place to take advantage of the controlled temperature cargo trend. So I often say the future is multimodal, and by this I mean transportation and the supply chain will demand a diverse portfolio of options to meet growing demand. Beyond cars and trucks, railroads, maritime ports, and even bikes, they'll all play a role in the future of supply chain and transportation. In particular, the nearly 70-year-old innovation of the intermodal container, which we're all so familiar of seeing it on highways or on major sort of large container ships, created and introduced into the supply chain in the mid-50s. You know, this is still providing an awesome benefit to our economy and our transportation ecosystem. Intermodal containers as a platform are secure, cost-effective, and they actually improve overall environmental impact of transporting cargo. Now, the growth and globalization that they have enabled may offset those environmental gains. I'm not trying to say this is primarily a green technology, but intermodal growth in the United States itself has put additional pressure on the network, on railroads to expand capacity and service offerings. For example, September and October were the 5th and 4th best months ever in US intermodal traffic, despite what's going on with COVID. So we're starting to see a shift towards intermodal as a preferred platform. September statistics from the Intermodal Association of North America show total shipments up 8.6 year on year, while the domestic container count was up nearly 15%. So we're seeing those growths domestically versus what we're seeing in the international space at a slower rate of increase. Much of the rise in intermodal is driven by e-commerce, by imports, but service interoperability offers benefits and supports intermodal growth. Being able to connect cargo from the rail, from the sea, from the trucks, down into urban fulfillment centers with ease. These are going to be important considerations in transportation in the future, and actually really right now. Ongoing investments in intermodal technology and facilities and assets, such as the CSX Carolina Connector and Rocky Mount, or expanded maritime ports on the East Coast. You're even seeing expanded vessel size carrying these containers. So planning around an intermodal future, I think, is important. But I said multimodal, and areas with strong transit systems are also in the mix as a beacon for companies and a great tool for economic development and recruiting. We're watching personal car ownership on the decline, and I think this is a factor that will remain relevant as for our workforce for years to come. We're seeing innovations pioneered in the dense urban centers of Europe being piloted here and applied here in the United States with eco-friendly and city-friendly delivery pilots on bikes or trikes. Companies like UPS and DHL, to name a few. Micromobility also plays into the game and offers some freight and logistics relevance. One overall takeaway from today is that the transportation sector must be more active and engaged in the data ecosystem. This includes improved collaboration and coordination beyond the walls of a government agency. And I'll say that sitting inside the highway building. We need more interaction and proactive engagement with industry, with commerce, and with community. The data that's out there, the data will drive the future of our sectors, yet the data we have is challenging. We need good, quality, reliable, and comparable data. And like I said, I think this is a huge weakness for our sector. There are also considerations beyond transportation and the supply chain, which will serve as disruptors and change agents in our space for years. And we have to address the challenges of global climate change and sea level rise. We're seeing policy and consumer-driven carbon reduction as a priority in purchasing and procurement, and downstream in the consumer market, where consumers want to purchase eco-friendly products. There is massive domestic and global income disparity. Yet as we see this disparity increase, we see the growth of a middle class in some areas, which is shifting consumption patterns and global trade. Access to market, I think, is something we've seen during COVID, is a lever for public health. You know, if you have a community that's not able to receive a short window delivery based on the transportation system or some other inefficiency that makes it economically unviable, then this becomes an issue for people who need their medicine or they need access to goods and services. It becomes a public health and public equity lever. I'd like to leave this question with, and I think Sarah also left us with this question, and how does transportation strategy, planning, design, and investment support a structural shift towards equity? And this is not a conversation that is going to go away. This is a very real challenge to our economy and our way of life. And I think it's something that we have to address in the transportation space. So looking forward, how can we change today to prepare for the future? How can changes in policy, procedure, design, planning, investment, and construction, how do they prepare us for tomorrow? I think there are a few key factors we have to consider in any approach. The first, as I mentioned a few slides ago, is data. We must prioritize quality data collection, sharing, and collaboration. The open source community is a great example of how democratic data can spur innovation and improvement. And I think that model gives us an opportunity to some degree in the public agency space and the broader transportation space. We must continue to look for ways to incorporate and integrate advanced technology. We must look across other industries and sectors to look at what technologies and innovations are applicable there and find a home and application for them in the transportation and supply chain space. We must continue to reduce barriers to pilot technologies or to pilot innovative practices. We should make it easy to pilot something, to test it out, and then revise it. And you get that practice, and we get better outcomes in a shorter amount of time. And lastly, like I said a couple of times, we have to take an ecosystem approach. We cannot imagine that putting a road here doesn't have ripple effects in all of these other areas. So I know we took it to probably 30,000 feet and talked a lot about sort of big economic topics today. And I'm probably leaving you with more information than you needed and maybe more questions than you had to start off with. But I'm glad we could dive into this. I think the conversation around how the supply chain operates and the demands it places on transportation and the ways in which both are changing, I think they're really important to what we do. Here's my contact information. If you'd like to talk more, connect with us. You can also visit the Office of Logistics and Freight online at our homepage or connect to NCDOT Connect resources. We'll be providing GIS and data resources for planners and engineers here in the near future. And that's it.
Thank you, Mr. Magliola. That was a great presentation with some really cool illustrations.
Yeah, I tried to find, I'm talking about the future, and I'm a big fan of retrofuturism, and there are some great and fairly accurately predictive art from the 50s and 60s that I thought fit the mode for today.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those with us. I forgot to mention at the beginning of our session today is sponsored by VHB, so thank you, VHB. Let's go to questions, see if we can get a couple questions answered. We have a total of 4 questions, I believe. The first one, I'll go in order. This is for our first presentation panelists. The question is, if you assume that post-COVID travel will return to normal, how do you keep the COVID impacted data from skewing our projections? I guess this question is for Kerry.
Hey, sorry about that. Can you read that question again?
Yeah,
sorry.
No problem. If you assume that post-COVID travel will return to normal, how do you keep the COVID impacted data from skewing your projections?
Okay. I think the question or the answer to that is kind of stay tuned, and that remains to be seen a little bit. We don't know exactly when numbers will return to normal right now. And once they do, I think we have to kind of take a step back and look at it and try to understand and reinterpret, FHWA guidance on traffic monitoring to sort of adjust our expectations. So, this is obviously unprecedented. We hear that word all the time, but we've not been through this process before. So, we're just focusing on trying to get as much data as we can to see if we can do some comparisons and figure out what are going to be some appropriate adjustment factors. And kind of figuring out and talking to other states and looking at that too.
Okay, great. Thank you for the explanation. I'll maybe do 1 or 2 more questions. The next one is also for the first presentation panelists. How do we reconcile the NCDOT traffic counts closely reflecting pre-pandemic numbers versus the vehicle miles traveled numbers and local traffic counts being roughly 10% lower than pre-pandemic conditions?
So I don't know if someone else in my presentation wants to jump in. I'm not sure if I fully understand. I guess the question. I guess the person who asked the question is asking about the, why is there kind of a difference in numbers?
Yes, let me try to read it again. How do we reconcile the NCDOT traffic counts closely reflecting pre-pandemic numbers versus the VMT numbers and local traffic counts being roughly 10% lower than pre-pandemic conditions?
Right. Well, I can speak to the DOT numbers. That's going to be very, very broad. Some of the other presenters talked about local traffic counts, which are going to be more reflective of those specific areas. Whereas we have 95 sites all over the state. Some are in rural areas, some are not. So there are going to be some differences in the data that you see between those two.
Okay.
Hey, Kerry.
Yep.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hey, this is Keith. I'll offer my perspective from a local standpoint. I think, like you said, the NCDOT data, you're talking about sort of the high volume, high-speed arterials versus some of the data that we have is on, it's on city thoroughfares, but they're much lower speed and lower volume than probably the data that you guys are collecting. So, you know, some of those workhorse arterials, you're seeing an uptick in traffic on those, and they're starting to reach the baseline levels. But locally, as you get down in classification of the roads that we counted, I think that might be a little bit, show you a little bit why you're seeing sort of the discrepancy between our numbers being 10 to 30% lower versus yours are starting to climb back up the baseline a little bit quicker, if that makes sense.
Thanks. Yep.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you, Kerry. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today. I want to thank all our speakers for their insights and passionate and eye-opening presentations. I also want to thank everyone for attending and asking good questions. Again, a big shout out to our sponsor for today's session, VHP, where people are working together to deliver resilient and sustainable solutions. We look forward to seeing everyone after the lunch break for 2 more sessions, multimodal in the Triangle and NCDOT IPD at 1 o'clock. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, so now I'm just kind of waiting on everyone to drop off to make sure I close it down, okay? Because I want to make sure the recording is good to go. But I think
when you close it, it should give you a little pop-up saying you have a recording to convert.
okay, so just close the whole dashboard.
Yeah, and just say like end the whole thing and it should do it. Unless you want me to do it, I can do it.
I can end for okay. I stopped the recording a minute or 2 ago, so we're good. All right, bye. Thanks, Grandpa.
See you.